So with all the rigmarole going on, next thing you know, the detachment that I was with, they transferred to Thailand. I helped pack them, but I had to wait a couple of weeks before I left.
It was in April '65, right?
And he ended up in April '65 going to Southeast Asia as a replacement. Normally an LBR unit, which stood for Local Base Rescue, was 2 airplanes and X number of crew chiefs, pilots, and firemen. But in ours, we were going into a combat rescue, and so we had 3 airplanes and had a supplement of pilots and crew chiefs, and we didn't fly with firemen, we flew with pararescue. We had a pararescue man on board that was, he could assist us. He'd be the one if somebody go down to, if we were to pick up an injured pilot, then he'd be the one to go down to cable and ensure that he got on board safely.
Let me stop you for 1 minute on that. Would you tell us about, your title was crew chief?
Flight engineer.
Okay, would you describe what your...
Basically, we're just glorified maintenance crews. And, most of the maintenance crews in these small outfits were also maintenance and flight crew chiefs. So we played a dual role. We gave the pilots an extra assistance. It was happy for him to know that the same guy that fixed the airplane was willing to fly on it. So he gave the pilot an extra edge, you might say.
And you also helped with the medical part too.
Right. My main function as a crew chief is to operate the hoist, which is a cable that extends from the airplane. Okay. Most of the terrain we would get into, we wouldn't be allowed to land on the ground. We'd have to go in and pick him up by hoist, and then hoist him into the airplane. If he needed medical assistance, the paramedic would be there, or if we needed to put the paramedic on the ground to retrieve him, then he was there for that purpose. But my main function is, the pilot is essentially blind at that point. So I'm sitting there looking down at the ground and telling them left, right, forward, to get over top of the target we're trying to pick up. And meanwhile, I'm dropping the hoist down.
Okay. Well, part of your story centers around September the 20th, 1965,
right,
when you were on an air rescue operation in Southeast Asia.
Well, when we went over in April of '65 as a replacement for the first air recovery in North Vietnam on the ground, and we did our thing and we were scheduled to come back home in July of '65, and they brought in the new, which later was named the Jolly Green Giant, that took over the rescue portion. But they had mechanical problems, and so we were extended through the duration, and we would be there until the new airplanes, just like anything else, had mechanical issues and all kinds of avionics issues and everything had to be dealt with before they were to release us. So we were essentially starting the 6th month of our 3-month TDY, and when we were called upon to go into North Vietnam on a rescue mission. And the problem then that we dealt with is that they had not fully wrote the book, you might say, on how we will be doing the rescue. There's a few things that could go wrong, did go wrong, and we'd talk about them later and try to improve them. But the problems were that because of the war being run from the bottom of the White House, that it takes a long time to transmit from one point to the other, and they had rules that weren't compatible to a successful rescue. Like we could not even get airborne until we had contact with the pilot on the ground. Well, at the same time, we're trying to establish contact. They are too. It's kind of like inviting people to a party and you're the last one to get there, and that's the kind of way it was when we got there. We were set up our grid, and like I said, we lost probably an hour and a half sitting on the ground that we could have used, because normally when an airplane coming off a diving bomb. He's doing 300, 400 miles an hour. So if he gets hit, he can get quite a few miles away from the heavily armed area, and just kind of going in and plucking him out. But like I said, with the time lost, they had a chance to look for him, and then they realized that we would come, so they just sit there and wait till we got there. And once we got into a hover, we were about 90 feet off the ground. The reason I know that is we have a cable that I spoke of earlier, and it's 100 feet long, and the last 10 feet of it's painted red. So I'm holding on the red cable, so I know I got everything I can get out of the airplane, and I'm guiding the pilot in over a target. Unfortunately, he was on the side of a hill, and we couldn't get down low enough, so we had to get out as close as we could, and then I had to swing the cable back and forth till I was able to swing it over to him, and as he got in it, then we started taking ground fire. And fortunate for us, the ground fire wasn't from below us, it was from above us. And the reason I'm here today is because sitting above me is the engine, transmission, and all the heavy gear that makes up that airplane. And they absorbed most of this bullets that were fired at us. There was a few that made it through the aircraft, but none through us. And they broke the plexiglass on the front of the airplane and things like that. But once they hit the fuel control, then we lost power, and we started chopping bamboo. And I'm telling you, the wooden blades on a HH-43 are just no match for bamboo. And so we essentially fell about 90 feet, and luckily, if I'd have fell on a hard floor like we have here, I probably would not have survived, because all that above me would have crushed us.
Yeah.
But because we God saw fit to give us a soft jungle floor, that absorbed most of the impact, we were able to walk away from the crash. All four of us on board walked away. We talked to the pilot. We were trying to rescue on the ground, and he told us the place was infested. Mm-hmm. And we know the rules of contact, that within 30 minutes they're going to send somebody in and blow that airplane up. Mm-hmm. And so we had to get out of the area as quickly as possible to not be part of that equation. Mm-hmm. And so we got out of the airplane, and we got a fairly decent distance from the airplane, probably a half a mile, something like that, weaving our way through wherever we didn't hear a sound come from. That's the direction we headed until we sought hiding. And of course it was late in the afternoon, and we knew that it'd be impossible with the number of people they had out there to do any traveling, so we sought hiding and was waiting for darkness. And unfortunately the Vietnamese found us. Mm-hmm. To complete that story, our co-pilot got separated from us, and when the Vietnamese captured us and the pilot, they didn't think to ask, or we didn't think to tell them, and we weren't going to tell them that there was another airman out there, and so therefore he was able to escape and he was not captured at that point, but he made it back into Laos, which we were only about 30 miles inside the North Vietnamese water from Laos. And unfortunately, when he got into Laos, he was captured, and he spent 2 years in captivity in Laos and was killed during an escape attempt in 1967, many years before we came home. There is a movie documenting that called Rescue Dawn, which is it's a Dingler story. Dingler was a Navy aviator, and he and Martin escaped together. And during the escape, Martin was essentially assassinated, and Dingler was able to get away and tell the story. And he wrote a book before he passed on, and then later it was made into a movie.
Well, once you were captured, and I don't want you to go into anything you don't feel comfortable sharing.
Oh, okay, no problem.
We want to keep it where you're not on edge or anything like that. I want you to.
Well, I'm pretty comfortable with it. Okay. I think a lot of times I think it's been a blessing that I've been able to talk about it, because then I don't have to dream about You
There
know,
you go.
that's what I see with my brothers out here. You know, is they want to talk about it, but they don't have anybody that they think can listen.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, that's the problem many of them have. And so I try to speak on their behalf.
Okay.
Yeah, and knowing the service and sacrifice they made,
Mm-hmm.
and it goes untold. I encourage my veterans to write their story down
Mm-hmm.
so that we don't deprive our families of our history. It doesn't have to be in a long form, it doesn't be in book form, but just some notes so that we all now are, as we get older, we wonder who in our family did what,
Oh,
you
yeah,
know, and I'm discovering I had family members that fought on both sides during the Civil War. So I mean, you know, it's just one of those things,
Sure.
and we know nothing about them,
Mm-hmm.
and because they failed to leave that just little note behind, and
Right.
that's the saddest part about all of our veterans who are passing away. They don't seem to think that's important, but it is important for their families, you know.
Sure.
And I have financially. So in some respects, that was a good thing that we set back communism in many ways,
Mm-hmm.
and so
Well, getting back to the day you were captured.
right.
After you're captured, can you kind of share with us what happened next?
Well, it was quite simple. It was kind of, you know, here I am standing there, 100 pounds heavier and a foot taller than they are. So you know, we just kind of stood out in the neighborhood, you know, and they were just curiosity seekers. I mean, they would come in and they just touch you to see if you were alive or what, you know, didn't know whether you were a machine or what. They just, you know, you got to remember these people didn't even have electricity at that point in life, and so you know, and communications weren't that good. But we were captured by the local militia. Now, once we went through, and it wasn't long, to somebody from the quote Communist Party with his blowhorn showed up, you know, and all of a sudden they hated our guts, and they started just beating the hell out of us for no reason at all, just because. Kind of like what you see on the news today, you know, you get an instigator in there that gets the crowd fired up, and we went through that 3 or 4 times as we were being transported we were being paraded around like a prize trophy, you might say. I guess that I always remember probably the deciding moment for me is that one morning they took me out and lined me up next to what I thought was a grave, you know, a great big hole in the ground. I don't know to this day whether it was fact or fiction, but it was very real to me at that point. I thought my life was over. I was just a month past my 22nd birthday, and I was looking at the hole. It was going to be my permanent retirement home, you know, and they, you know, read something that sounded like a official document. Of course, I didn't understand Vietnamese, but I know the process. You know, I was being, by one individual, I was being tried, found guilty, and he would certify my execution. And right now, while I'm sitting there, I can see from the shadows. I got my feet tied together, my hands tied together, hands tied to my feet. I'm blindfolded, but I could see from the shadows 2 men standing behind me with rifles, you know, so I knew that this didn't look good at this point. So, you know, I think I created speed dial at that point. And I got right with the man, but all of a sudden it just went dead silent, and the 2 guards, one under each arm, stuck their arms between my arms and my shoulders, and lifted me up and put me back on my feet and took me back to my room or my cell. And from that point on, I knew I was going to survive.
Okay.
I didn't know what the future held at this point, but God had sent me a message that I was going to survive. I just had to take care of myself the
There you
best I
go.
could from
Yeah.
this point.
Well, I know one of the places was the Hanoi Hilton,
Right.
and today you brought a brick from the Hanoi.
Yeah.
So would you pick that up and then just tell us a little bit about your experience as a prisoner of war?
Well, this is a brick from the Hanoi Hilton, and when I went back in 1995, I retrieved this brick as they were tearing the Hilton down, and but that was my entry point. You might say it's simply the processing center for American prisoners captured in North Vietnam, and when we arrived there, we had traveled for 8 days. We had experienced rain, snow, or not snow, but rain, and all kinds of bad weather and good weather. We had walked, and the Vietnamese had one special technique. They would tie our hands behind us and take one shoe from us. So it's difficult to run with one shoe on and one off. It was difficult to run, if you have both shoes on, you can run a lot faster than you can, or both shoes off, but one in one is pretty tough when you got boots on. So that was one of the smaller techniques that they used, plus you were always tied, and anytime you were moving, you had a blindfold on. They would occasionally let us lean back and look out from underneath the blindfold, but that was occasionally. Some of the things I experienced during that 8 days, I was met with what we call the one-armed bandit. He is noted for having killed at least 5 Americans during captivity, just beat them to death, and so I didn't know that at that time, but that was the first time I experienced real torture, was that they had put the ropes on me so tight around my arms that, the scratches I had on my short sleeve shirt, the scratches I had on my arm, and the blood was just oozing out of them and I lost all the feelings in my hands for about 2 days. I couldn't even feed myself, so, they'd put a bowl of food in front of you, and it was all you could do is lift your hands and you just lean over and lick it like a dog, and that's the way we survived.
How often would they interrogate you?
Well, in the first 6 months, it was almost daily.
So did they speak to you in English?
Once we got into Hanoi, most of them spoke English, and some of the higher ups would use the translator, but most of them spoke English, and they spoke pretty decent English. And of course, like I said, that some of those guys had come up from the South, when Vietnam was, when they started choosing sides back in '45, and that's the way that was. And but it started out with a simple thing: name, rank, and serial number, and then they wanted what unit you were with, and then we went through this for a while, and then they wanted us, I guess the biggest thing they wanted us to do was condemn our government. Mm-hmm. They wanted us to take the side of the peace-loving American people and spew hate to the warmongers who were creating the war, and of course, that was not in our DNA to do that. So we used every means available to minimize any propaganda value of anything they were able to retrieve. It's just not one of those things that you can break someone. But our leaders were smart enough to say, don't make them, it was okay to get hurt, but not to sustain permanent injury. In other words, you just didn't want to roll over. But you don't want to sustain permanent injury. You don't want to push it to a point that you lose control. So you were always about maintaining control. And that way you could kind of control what you wrote or what you didn't write. But if you were pushed to the brink that you would do anything, then to get out of it, then you were losing rather than them.
Right.
And so it was a fine line as to. I know the first time that I thought I had given something up, and I came back and I cried like a baby, thought I had to dishonored myself, my family, my country, and and it was devastating. And one of the leaders says, get over it, bounce back, get ready for the next round. Said, and we'll all return with honor. And so, it was just you had to do what you had to do, and many of us, when we were forced to write, we would use fictitious characters in our writings, so that it's amazing how many different airplanes that Clark Kent flew during the Vietnam War. And Ben Casey was in there, Red Button, all these TV and movie characters all played a part in the Vietnam War. So that if anything was said, was released, somebody would look at it and say, what a pile of crap, and that's kind of, it worked for us, and the important thing for us is to remember what you said, because, you didn't know when you were going to get out there and they might bring it up again.
How often were you allowed to write letters back home?
Well, in my particular case, I wrote about 3 letters a year, and probably 1 a year got mailed to the family. You write a letter, and if they didn't like it, they just trash it. Mm-hmm. And they got a little better towards the end. And some guys never had the opportunity to write a letter or receive a letter during the whole captivity. In fact, the first letter I wrote was in December of '65, and my family got it in March of '66. It was given to a visiting Eastern Bloc country, and they mailed it, and it actually came to my house. And of course, my dad got the letter, and he immediately called the Air Force and said, I got a letter from my son today, and they said, that's impossible. He said, well, I'm looking at it, And they said, well, send it to us. And my dad said, it'd be a cold day in hell. Well, if you want this letter, you better bring a copy machine and make a copy of it. So they came to the house, I learned later, and made a copy of it, fingerprinted and everything, and what they were looking for was fingerprints of other people. Because if we had the opportunity, if 2 of us went in and wrote a letter together, we'd put our fingerprint on the other guy's letter, and things like that, and we wrote in code, the careful part was you had to make sure that you didn't say anything that they would throw the letter away, and that's what you run into. But during the first, like I said, the tragedies that overcome by events was in '66, after we'd been there a while. Ho Chi Minh went out and told everybody that, what he did was he took 66 Americans and marched them down the streets of Hanoi, and they got to leaving the hell beat out of them. And it caused a war revolt, you might say. This is not the way you treat prisoners. And Ho Chi Minh didn't apologize, but he said all those who asked for forgiveness will be forgiven, because he said that, we all would be tried, and we wouldn't some of us would not ever come home. And so he created his own out, and so they brought in the leg irons and handcuffs and ropes, and they wanted us to choose 1 or 2 ways out of the Warmonger and Johnson administration or the peace-loving American people. Lo and behold, when we refused to make a choice, so they beat the hell out of us again. So then when we made a choice, we made the wrong choice, so they beat the hell out of us again. So it took about 4 whippings. We all, in some way, again, using whatever method we could, describe how sorry we felt, if we caused any harm. We probably wrote the same apology that Jane Fonda wrote to us. They felt fascinated that how strong we were, and among themselves they thought it was, that they would recognize. Again, you're always trying to recognize people, and they went to the senior ranking officer in our section, and he agreed to it, and he passed it on to to the seniors, and it finally got to General Flynn, who was a senior ranking officer, and he said it was a great idea, you know, and then, you know, this takes time, and then once they approved it, then he sent another note back, you know, like I said, and it said, oh, by the way, I understand we have 3 new lieutenants in our midst that have never been to OTS. And so we had basically 2 Air Force Academy graduates and 2 Naval Academy graduates that, with input from others, established a training for us, you know, just the basic knowledge, you know, what is expected, you know, and I guess that in one of my stories was I had to write a 500 words memory, you might say, and more of a memory thing, but of something that was significant to me, and I wrote that on the War of 1812. You know, I wrote about Francis Scott Keith and what he saw when he woke up that morning on an enemy ship, you know, and the story behind that particular flag, you know, and you know the story that they said that they were, some of the weaker leaders said we need to take our flag down because we don't want the enemy to know where we are. And the other guy said, no, we're going to put up a 50-foot flag so they know exactly where we are. Yeah. And that became the, you know, this country is about. We don't hide anything, you know, and that's the problem we have today is that too many people want to hide things rather than admit things that didn't go right a long time ago and want people 5 generations later to be held responsible for something we didn't do. You know, and so these are, but you know, it was very emotional to just to think about what he went through that night and why he wrote the words he wrote, and ended up being our national anthem. That what he saw was, you know, was at that particular time, and we had other responsibilities. You know, like I learned. And so that, you know, it's written on the Academy walls of the Air Force Academy is that, you know, that man's flight through life is sustained by the power of his knowledge. And we considered ourselves a different breed of cat right from the beginning. We flew through the air while they walked on the ground, you know, things like that. And of course, the 13th commandment at the Naval Academy is what you do if you see a midshipman laying in a ditch with his name tag exposed. You roll him over so nobody can read his name tag.
I knew something like that was coming. Okay, so now on the positive. On the positive, after the training, officer training school that you had, you became a captain, right?
Well, no.
No.
When I came home in '73, the Air Force said that was a good idea, but says it ain't gonna happen. So we'll talk to General Flynn when he gets back. He was in the later group, and in March of '73, General Flynn, the time he could have been spending with his family, he spent in Washington for his family. He went into every office in the Department of the Air Force pleading his case for 3 airmen, armed with letters from those constituents we had lived with in prison that wanted us to commission. And he was given one no after another. He could have accepted the first no and moved on, and he went all the way through Secretary of the Air Force, went through the chain of command, ended up in the Secretary of Defense office. And basically, they recited all these other incidents. If they won't do it, he 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 won't do it. He said, what makes you think I'm going to do it? And John Peter Flynn said, I'd like a meeting with the president. And so John Peter Flynn got that meeting. And he went in there and briefed President Nixon. And you'll have to excuse my French, but I like to decide to just lay the president did. And President Nixon, when John Peter Flynn got done, President Nixon said, shit hot idea. And so we were commissioned 3 days later.
Wow.
So I can truly say I got a presidential appointment.
There you go.
And that was in February of '73, and I retired as a captain in '84.